Good evening. I'm Martha Williams, Programs and Education Manager at the Community Library in Ketchum, and I'd like to welcome you all to the third and final session of this collaborative series, Creating Pathways to Learning for Everyone, hosted by the Lee Pesky Learning Center and the Community Library. And with me tonight is Dr. Evelyn Johnson, CEO of the Lee Pesky Learning Center and a professor of special education at Boise State University. I'd like to open us tonight with a quote from one of my favorite books. And if you've been tuning into this series, you know this is a tradition at the library. We love to read from a book or recommend a book when we begin our programs. And so this book is Reading Lolita in Tehran by Azar Nafisi. And it is a book I have read no less than 5 times, I think. It's a memoir in books, she calls it, which means that she tells stories from a particular period of her life through the lens of literature. Nafisi was a professor of English in Tehran during the 1980s and 1990s under the Islamic Republic. And she saw the transition from a time when women attended college to a time when they were no longer allowed to. So in the opening part of this book, she introduces us to a group of female students whom, after the universities have been barred from allowing female students, she invites this group of her former students into her home to have a literature class every week in her living room. Throughout the book, she talks about how literature gives a different color to our lives, how the act of reading can be a sensation, and how reading fiction in particular allows us to surpass the limits of our realities. The role of imagination and reading in our everyday lives becomes an unending journey, in her words. This was our first session. All of us had been nervous and inarticulate. We were used to meeting in public, mainly in classrooms and in lecture halls. The girls had their separate relationships with me and a certain friendship with others. Some were not so close. In many cases, in fact, they would have never have chosen to have been friends. I had explained to them the purpose of the class: to read, discuss, and respond to works of fiction. They would each have a private diary recording their responses to the novels. I explained that I had chosen them for this class because they seemed dedicated to the study of literature. I mentioned that one of the criteria for the books I had chosen was their author's faith in the critical and almost magical power of literature, and reminded them of the 19-year-old Nabokov, who during the Russian Revolution would not allow himself to be diverted by the sound of bullets. Let us see, I said, whether 70 years later, our disinterested faith will reward us by transforming the gloomy reality created of this other revolution. I formulated certain general questions for them to consider, the most central of which was how these great works of imagination could help us in our present trapped situation as women. We were not looking for blueprints, for an easy solution, but we did hope to find a link between the open spaces the novels provided and the closed ones we were confined to. I remember reading to my girls Nabokov's claim that readers were born free and ought to remain free. So I thought that was a nice intro for our discussion tonight on literacy, and particularly in light of a world where things are closed off to many of us. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Evelyn for the next few moments. As I mentioned, this is the third session of this series, and so Evelyn is going to do a recap of the first 2 sessions just to get everyone up to speed if you missed those.
Great. Thanks, Martha. It's really nice to be here with you tonight, and thanks for everybody who's online. I was going to let people know that if they had comments, they can ask questions in the chat, but I see I don't have to do that. We've already got some great participation. It's awesome. So we encourage you to put your thoughts and questions. Martha and I certainly have some things to talk about, but we've also made sure to leave some time so that we can make this session interactive. Yeah, if you're joining us for the first time, or if like me, it's challenging to remember things that happened much more than just a few hours ago, given all the hectic nature of the times these days. Um, the sessions that we have put together so far, the focus is on talking about the opportunity gap in education, and specifically how it plays out in the Wood River Valley, and more importantly, what we can do about it. So in the first session, Jenny Davidson from the library and I took some time to set up the issue, and really wanted people to understand why it's so important that we use the term opportunity gap. Some people may be more familiar with a student achievement gap. And what we're talking about is this longstanding difference in performance on a whole host of metrics, largely standardized assessments, and we're particularly focused on reading and literacy in these sessions, that exist between predominantly white affluent students and students who are from underserved populations, like students with disabilities, which is the population that we serve at Lee Pesky Learning Center, students who are Latino, students who are Black, Native American, students who live in poverty. And the reason why we really want people to adopt the phrase opportunity gap rather than achievement gap is because achievement gap signals that it's somehow the student's fault, like they're not working hard enough or they're not capable. And really, we want to reframe the discussion. We certainly didn't coin the phrase opportunity gap. Writers like Ibram Kendi have been writing about this, that what it signals is that there are some inequities, structural and systemic inequities in our education system that deny these underserved groups of students the opportunity to reach their full potential. And if we're going to meaningfully address it, we really have to think about that on a systems level. So that was a pretty heavy first session in talking about that topic and what it looks like in Blaine County and Wood River. In the second session with Deanne Campbell, we really focused on community solutions and looked more at these like shorter, what we called shorter term, more urgent solutions. And we had the opportunity to share with everybody in the audience some of the fantastic work that's happening in the Valley. I mean, the community library has amazing programs, the programs that we're running. I'm going to name a couple organizations. I'm always reluctant to do that because I'll inadvertently leave someone out, and I apologize ahead of time for that. But the Wood River Y and their Power Scholars program, I Have a Dream Foundation, Blaine County Ed Foundation, the Space, organizations that aren't necessarily directly related to education but serve the family, which of course then strengthens the whole family unit, which is important for education. So yeah, thanks. Neighbors Helping Neighbors, the Alliance, Advocates, Hunger Coalition. There are a lot of wonderful organizations doing extremely good work in the Valley. And these programs are certainly needed. The point that we tried to make in that second session was, while those programs are important, they're necessary, we also really need to start thinking about what are some longer term solutions. And in particular, as we head back into the school year and certainly face a year in which these disparities are likely to get worse rather than better, what do we need to do about it as a community? So that's the hefty topic that we'll be taking on tonight.
And I already see a comment from Heather. We do hope to answer some of your questions about how you can help students more immediately. We had initially talked about really framing our entire conversation around that. And then as it came to get closer to the school start and there are still so many unknowns, we decided not to tackle that at the forefront. So as Evelyn said, we're going to talk more about long-term solutions, but would love to try and answer your questions about more immediate support for students this year. So Evelyn, we've talked about a few things kind of leading into the discussion for long-term changes. And something you've really emphasized is for a need for these changes to really be based on data and research. So could you talk a little bit about, I know you've done a lot of research around proficiency scores and what we're looking at there in terms of just kind of some of the issues we need to address with long-term solutions.
Yeah, I'm using Blaine County School District stats, but I do want to emphasize that the opportunity gap is not unique to Blaine County. It's not unique to Idaho. It is a national phenomenon. Louisa Moats, who I know is on tonight, shared an article from APM Reports about how our public school system is failing students, in particular students of color, in learning to read. I'll put a link up in the chat in a minute for people who are interested in hearing that. It's incredibly well done. But one of the interesting things about Blaine County, of course, is that there are a lot of resources within the county, and so because it's located in a resort town, we have some pretty significant disparities in terms of income in population. And one of the positive things is that there are resources in the valley to address some of the issues that we're going to talk about. And that's really important, right? that we have some way to draw resources to address issues. But when I looked at stats, what I learned is that the school district is about 42% of the student population is Latino. So, getting close to half. And in a few years, I'm sure that number will be closer to 50%. And yet, I pulled some numbers. I did write them down, so forgive me while I look at some notes. But in the 2019 school year, when we look at performance on the Idaho state tests of achievement in English language arts. So this is a standardized assessment that's given every spring to every student in third grade up through high school. And when I wrote down the percentage of students who were able to achieve proficient or advanced levels, so those are the levels that are considered at grade level or above, across grade levels, there is anywhere from a 19 all the way up to a 43 percentage point difference in the number of students who are white compared to the number of students who are Latino, who were able to meet those grade level targets. When I pulled the information for math in our second session, Eric Tishalis made the great point of the importance of math and how that's related to literacy development as well and school success. And the numbers look about the same. There, the range is anywhere from 28 to a high of 43%. This isn't just, so this was based on 2019 before the pandemic hit. You can go back many years and look at data, and these numbers stay the same. And so it's hugely problematic, right? We have a significant percentage of the population whose needs appear to, it appears that they're not being met very well, at least if we base it on standardized test scores. Of course, that's not the only metric of schools, but it is an important one.
Mm-hmm. And we've talked about a few other factors contributing to student performance positively and negatively: access to quality childcare, having social emotional learning integrated into the teacher's approaches, evidence-based reading instruction, Could you talk a little bit about those as well?
Yeah, I'm going to mostly focus on the evidence-based reading instruction because of all of the factors that you mentioned. They're all important without a doubt. But when I think about what school systems can do, that's the one around which they have the most control, right? And it's frankly the one where I think we have a lot of information about what needs to be done. It really is now a matter of doing it. And so this report that I referenced earlier, that I found through a posting that Louisa made, really highlighted this issue that there are a lot is known about the reading process, right? We know that in order for students to learn to read well, they need to have two things, right? There's a process called the simple view of reading, and it breaks down a very complex construct like reading, right? The act of reading is very complex, but it gives this sort of overarching theory about reading that in order for a student to develop strong reading comprehension, that is a function of their listening or language comprehension and their ability to decode or read the words on the page. And if a child is compromised in one or both of those two areas, then reading comprehension is going to be compromised as well. And so we know from decades of research that systematic, explicit instruction in decoding is a very effective way of helping students develop the decoding skills that they need. What we're learning more and more about is how important language development is too, right? So we saw this summer in the reading program that we ran in partnership with you and at the community campus for English learners, that even when you can teach a student to decode a word, if they don't have the knowledge of that word, right, if they don't have the language and the vocabulary, they can say it, but if they don't know the meaning, it's not going to facilitate comprehension. If there are enough words in a text or a passage that they're reading, then their entire, their ability to comprehend that entire text is compromised, right? We can fill in gaps when there's only maybe one or two unknown words. When the percentage of unknown words starts getting, much past 5-10%, it's very difficult to then comprehend what we're reading. And what we have found in our work, we have a professional development team that works across the state. We also work in other states, training teachers and providing ongoing coaching and professional development to help schools implement evidence-based reading instruction, is that too many schools are not doing this. I can't speak specifically to Blaine County, but there are a number of schools, again, this is not unique to Idaho, it's nationally, where teachers either haven't received the kind of training that they need in their pre-service programs, or they have, but they maybe enter school systems where there's not an evidence-based reading curricula, or there is, but it's not enforced to be used, right? They're not held accountable for using it. And so many students are simply not getting the kind of reading instruction that they need. Hands down, that's the most immediate yet long-term thing that we can do, that we can change in school systems to better support the outcomes for all students, and in particular for students who are struggling due to the opportunity gap.
And in terms of the opportunity gap being widened right now by COVID and school kind of hybrid models and closures to an extent, I believe, can that evidence-based reading instruction happen online? Is that something that we are losing this fall?
It can happen online. I do not want to suggest that it will be easy. Teachers are people, and like everyone, are struggling in different ways with all of the change and issues. So I don't want to make it sound like it's, hey, just start doing this and everything will be okay. And at the same time, there are ways that we can translate the evidence-based practices to an online setting. Our team of professional development experts have prepared some online trainings that we started with our evidence-based reading instructional trainings as the core, and what they did was modeled and provided a variety of ways that teachers can adapt what they're doing to an online environment. As a matter of fact, the summer program that we were running in person, one-on-one outdoors with English learners, we have now switched to virtual delivery. We do now have well-established relationships with those students, but we have been able to use online materials. We are meeting synchronously, right? So we're meeting at the same time, talking to each other, and using the same materials, but we put them online, obviously, and then made some adaptations so that students can respond clearly. And I don't have wood handy, but I'll knock wood. It seems to be going well, and students are making really good progress.
Well, that makes sense. You have an established model, you have an established relationship, and that gives you the opportunity to really start creating that long-term change for them. And I have to say, it was magical to walk by every week when you were with students. You and your staff were with students outside the library near the children's library. It was fun to witness that from a distance. Another thing we've talked about is diversity in staff, and especially that statistic about 42% of students in Blaine County being Hispanic, and the growth that we are seeing in the Valley, especially right now. I know you have noted that, and this is true of anyone, people perform better when they see someone in authority who looks like them. Can you talk a little bit more about how that can be a really important factor in this long-term perspective?
Yeah, there's some really interesting research around this issue, and some of it focuses on things like disciplinary practices when a teaching staff is mostly white and students are mostly of color, that disciplinary actions like suspension are greatly increased. I'm listening to the Serial podcast called Nice White Parents, and they just did an episode where they talked they talked about this particular issue about suspension. And the reporter had looked up in New York City last year, I think there were 400 suspensions. 9 of those students were white, 390 some were students of color. And so it's even larger than just having a mentor to look up to. It's that cultural sensitivity, cultural awareness. There's so much to it. In the reading report, a researcher by the name of Julie Washington talks about differences in spoken English. She is African American, and she talks about differences in Black English and how students have to code switch. It made me think a lot about students in Wood River Valley who are Spanish-speaking, native Spanish speakers, and we certainly saw this summer how difficult, like how much attention and just concentration has to go into decoding a word in your second language, trying to figure out, is that a word I know? and then holding on to all of that information while you're reading a text and and come to some understanding about what it is that you've read. And when you have teachers who are aware of that, who are sensitive to that, so teaching practices can be much different, I think, right? Like it's important. The other issue that's really critical is to have a more diverse leadership, right? So that as districts and schools are thinking about where are my priorities, if we don't have all voices represented at the table, it's very easy to leave out entire populations of students, right? Again, speaking as someone who has worked for over 25 years now in the field of special education, that is a constant battle for people who either advocate for or work with or represent students with disabilities. Is anytime there's education reform or new initiatives, it seems like students with disabilities are sort of put over here as like something we'll get to later and we'll figure out how it will work for them, rather than being part of the conversation from the get-go. And so again, when we don't have all voices at the table, I think that's the issue, and we see it here now, right? I mean, we're all working on these supplemental, how do we help people catch up, when really the conversation should be, how do we design a system that is truly serving all students well?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And having teachers and leaders, and I'm sorry, someone just turned all the lights off in the library. I think you can still see me. How do we train teachers and leaders to be empathetic towards students, right, especially smaller groups that may not be represented? You shared with me a dissertation that looked at the impact of teaching a predominantly all-white teacher group Spanish, and found that teacher empathy and expectations for Latino students was positively impacted by that experience. And that was really powerful to me, because maybe there are instances where it's difficult to get that diversity on staff for various reasons, or on leadership. And that could be another approach to really trying to address everybody's needs a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, that dissertation was so interesting, and I thought it was a fascinating response to that challenge, right? Because I know from working in our teacher prep program at Boise State, we are not recruiting a very diverse group of teacher candidates. We work on it. We have worked with the university to offer scholarships, and we work with a program called CAMP that is specifically for first-generation college students. And we try to recruit students from that program to enter the teaching field. They are mostly native Spanish speaking or Latino students. And it's challenging because teaching, unfortunately, is not a profession where you are going to earn a great deal. If in terms of salaries, we underpay our teachers. And so if you have a shot at going to college, it's not always going to be a draw. And so we have to figure out ways to problem solve around that. Earlier you mentioned social emotional, and I think that dissertation is related to that, right? Like teachers who went through the process of learning a second language and realizing how difficult it is, and how something that's very easy for you in your native language suddenly becomes so challenging when it's in a second language. That helps teachers develop empathy. And we also have an approach to learning that we call self-regulated learning that attempts to do the same thing, right? We really work with teachers to understand that students, when they behave in a way that we might not think is appropriate, or they shut down because they're exhausted from the effort of trying to learn. Or it's easier to act out, right? In a classroom, if I know I'm a struggling reader and maybe I don't want all my classmates to know that, it's easier for me to be a class clown or to get in trouble and get thrown out of the lesson than it is for me to struggle through that lesson. And so, as part of our work to really integrate social emotional with academic, we work with teachers to help them understand that behavior is not directed towards them, right? It is a way for students to communicate that they are being challenged and they need support. And then we work with teachers to develop really positive learning environments where students are, they know that not only is it okay to make mistakes, but it's expected, right? Like that's part of how we learn. I mean, I don't know about you, but I know like trying new things. You know, my kids are trying to teach me to water ski, and yeah, anyway, it was fun.
Yeah.
but it was hard. And they weren't so, my children weren't so understanding, but I wish they had been. I probably would have kept going instead of falling off a couple times and saying, okay, I've had enough. But in a similar way, right, when we're in the classroom, it's really important to understand that when students want to do well, they want to learn, right? And so if we can create an environment where we are accepting, where we understand that kids are at individual levels, and different students need different things, that can go a long way towards creating that safe environment where then kids start to develop more of that self-regulated capacities that help them become more successful learners.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think here we're really starting to dig into some of the longer term ideas and approaches. And it seems clear that we know how a lot of them could turn out. We know the impact of some of the actions. And so it seems like it takes identifying what they are and then committing to them. So maybe we can start kind of just talking about what those are. You know, for organizations, the library, Lee Pesky, and the other great organizations you've mentioned who are doing work here, and the community at large. There's a lot that we can all be doing. So what can you talk a little bit about some of the ideas you have?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot in a lot of different ways, trying to answer that question. I don't know if I've come up with it at all, but I do think a reasonable starting point for, I'll say, the Wood River community is to engage in really taking like a comprehensive look at, first of all, what the research says in terms of the opportunity gap, what things are successful, you know, what kinds of programs seem to be effective, what does the research around bias and teacher perceptions, you know, what does that all say? And try to, this is a huge task, but I think it's possible, at least do some synthesis of that body of work, right? As a researcher, we're always about controlling and narrowing the problem that we're studying, right? Because we want to really get an idea of how X impacts Y. I mean, in a nutshell. And that's important for understanding, you know, what factors impact different outcomes. But sometimes when we just look at like one piece of research, we can start to fall into this notion that that's the silver bullet, right? If we only had school uniforms, right? Or if we only had this 10-minute supplemental reading program that's delivered online. If we only had like this one thing, all our problems would be solved. And that's not true. There are lots of programs that are effective, but no one thing is likely, no one small thing is or program is likely to address this issue. So my thinking is if we can get a much more like the landscape, like what are the things within a community that are contributing to the opportunity gap, and we have a pretty good idea of what those are, and then engage in a needs assessment of sorts, right? So what are the things that are in place that we're doing well, that are effective, and then where where are we not quite meeting the mark, right? And so and then what are the priorities for starting to address these issues? And it's easy to talk about. It's a lot harder process to engage in. I was sharing with someone not in the Wood River not too long ago. In the Treasure Valley, there was an effort a number of years ago to do something very similar. It was the Treasure Valley Ed Partnership. And it was this really impressive feat to get a number of the Treasure Valley school districts, nonprofit organizations. We participated, as well as a host of others, community and business leaders, to come together and identify and engage in an activity much like the one I just described. It wasn't necessarily focused on opportunity gap for students of color, but it was focused on early literacy and in particular students in poverty, and there's a lot of overlap in those populations, unfortunately. And that partnership identified a number of goals and objectives and priorities that everyone agreed we should invest in. Unfortunately, some of the initiatives were carried out. So one of the things that remained a focus, and we continue to be active in this, is on early literacy development. And so that was a positive that came out of that. A number of the other initiatives, unfortunately, were not as successful as being carried through. But to me, what that shows is that we just tried to take on too much at once, and that by identifying much smaller, more specific priorities, it is possible, right? Like a huge group of people came together and put into place a number of programs both within the school as well as in out of school organizations to focus on improving early literacy. If we can do something like that in Wood River, I think that it would give us a common focus to get started. And obviously the challenge in that is deciding on the priorities, right? Because everything seems urgent right now. There's so much need in so many ways, and so coming to agreement on what problems to tackle first, I think that will be a challenge, but it's not insurmountable.
Yeah, I was thinking of asking, and it may not apply as much since you're talking about kind of focusing more, but I was curious if you know of communities or school districts who have done this kind of really big, comprehensive evaluation, the needs assessment, and made progress from that we can cite, that we can look to as examples. Are there any good examples?
Yeah. Again, I'll reference the Nice White Parents podcast. They actually shared an example of a school in New York City, and it's undergone several name changes. And now you put me on the spot, and I won't be able to pull up the name, but it will come to me, and I'll like blurt it out or type it in the chat box. But they committed to being a school committed to racial equity. And and here's Louisa weighing in. The state of Mississippi did it. That's right. Thank you for the reminder, Louisa. So Louisa worked with the state of Mississippi, and the State Department of Education decided that they were going to commit to improving reading, and the way they were going to do that was essentially to require the use of evidence-based reading practices. And so from the state to the districts to the schools, this plan around using evidence-based reading practices was put into place. And as she kindly noted in the chat box, there's been significant improvement in their test scores as a result. Many years ago, when the Reading First initiative was still in place, there were so many schools. Our current services director at the center, Laura Moylan, was the principal at Van Buren Elementary in the Caldwell School District. And they committed to, their goal was to have 100% of their students meet grade level reading targets. They didn't reach 100%, but they were well into the 90s, and that school serves a predominantly very low SES, predominantly Hispanic student population. And there are a number of schools in Washington, in Kennewick, Washington, that committed to this goal, right? Like, we are going to get all of our students reading, and they put their energy behind it. And when they did, they got results.
Well, and it seems like there'd be few people who would disagree with wanting these things, wanting kids to have better reading, better opportunities for learning about literacy, better skills. I think we wouldn't find many people who don't want these things, but there is a barrier to making these things happen, clearly, because they're not happening everywhere and maybe as often as we'd like. So why is that, do you think? What are some of the obstacles we need to overcome, or maybe the opportunities that we have, maybe a better way to phrase it?
I ask myself that question a lot. I think so. Amanda Ripley years ago wrote a book, The Smartest Kids in the World. And she was doing a lot of comparison of the US school system, particularly to the Finnish school system, where there's very high student achievement. And one of the things that she noticed about the US system is that there's all these, I'm going to say distractions, for lack of a better word. There are sports programs where kids are pulled out and schedules are interrupted, and entire busing schedules are made around how we carry out a sports and athletic program. There are fundraisers. There are, this additional activity. We see it in the work that we're doing with the Idaho Early Literacy Program, where we are working with a number of districts across the state to help them implement evidence-based reading practices. And the number of times that our coaches have scheduled to go into a building and then are told, oh, well, we have this assembly or this special program, or this is happening, or we're not doing reading today because it adds up. I think I mentioned this with when Jenny and I were talking, but the Annenberg Institute at Brown did this really interesting study looking at interruptions to instructional time and how these impact students. And they also found that there was some inequities here, that the number of disruptions in schools that are based in lower income areas is significantly higher, right? And they counted lots of things as interruptions. So not just the big things that I mentioned, but people coming into the classroom, announcements coming in over the intercom, all those things that draw the attention and interrupt the flow of instruction. So in the schools that have been successful in improving their reading. Not only is there this commitment that we are going to use evidence-based practice, but essentially the reading instructional time becomes like this is it, right? Like there is nothing that is going to interrupt this instructional time. Like it is dedicated to reading, and that is it. And that's the kind of focus, I think, and thought process that has to go into creating a system that's really going to help students, all students, achieve to their potential.
It's almost a sacred commitment to reading, which we certainly value here at the library.
Yeah.
Let's see, just kind of scanning the questions.
Yeah, I did, not to jump around too much, but Heather, I saw asked a question about how to work with a teen who is on a 504 with distance learning. So for people who aren't familiar, a 504 plan is a plan to provide accommodations to students who have a disability. They may not need individually designed instruction, but they do need accommodations to access instruction. And Heather, we can't go into a ton of detail, but I'd be happy for you to email and email me at the Lee Pesky Learning Center. If you get on our website, you can get my email address. But some of the same things that work in the classroom are going to work with online, right? We need to have some routine and structured schedules. We need to minimize distractions. One of the things that I'm learning, that I don't know why it took me a while to realize this, but in working one-on-one over the computer with students, they get tired a lot faster. So the summer program, we were working in 30-minute sessions because we're working with 6-year-olds, and they would need a break when we were meeting in person, but not all the time. And part of that, we were outside, and there's some natural ways to take breaks when we're online, and you can't read body cues as well, and there's weird tech stuff happening, and sometimes you can't hear as well. You get tired much faster. And so it took me a couple sessions, but we learned to build in breaks. So asking for those, or just letting, if there is a teacher on the other side, letting them know that he's gonna or she is going to need to be able to move. I have a treadmill desk. I'm not suggesting people invest in that, but it allows you to move. So, things that allow you to get some movement, because that sitting and focusing on your computer would all be some things that I would recommend, as well as taking advantage of all of the assistive technology that you can. But Heather, please email me, and I'd be happy to continue that conversation with you.
And we're getting some other great questions from Janet about maybe could there be a continuing conversation about working with adult English learners in the Wood River Valley. And I'll credit Janet. Janet is an ESL teacher, and she does classes here at the library when we are able to. And we're looking forward to continuing those sometime. And she points out about cultivating literacy circles within families, libraries, and schools, which kind of feeds nicely into Leona's question about Latino culture placing a high emphasis on the family. And so she asks, are there family-centered models we could emulate? Help a child by helping the entire family. Can you speak to that at all, Evelyn?
I will certainly try. First, I'll share a specific example that gets at what both Janet and Leona are discussing. One of the families this summer who enrolled both of their sons in our reading program. So my son was the reading instructor, and we did that because he's fluent in Spanish and has experience as working as a tutor. And so it was just invaluable for him to be able to communicate well with the parents, to explain what we were doing. And when we gave them things to take home, to explain how they can sit and work with their child on getting some additional practice. And the one family, the mom and a couple times the dad would sit in on the lessons with the younger son, because she wanted to learn to read English, and she wanted to see what we were doing so that she could then do the same at home. And so, yes, many years ago, when I was at the University of Washington doing my doctoral studies, there was a professor there. His name was Tom Lovett, and he ran a program very similar to what Jana and Leona are suggesting, where it started out as a reading intervention program for students, and there was an apartment complex where there was a very large number of Spanish-speaking families lived in this apartment complex, and so they made use of the of like the, how like apartment complexes will have like a clubhouse or a common room, and so they ran an after-school tutoring program there, and within 2 to 3 weeks, the parents who were walking their children over said, I never graduated high school, or I'd like to go to college, but I need to develop stronger skills. And pretty soon it evolved into a family program for parents, where the instruction was to support them and to also work with their children. And it was incredibly effective, right? Because it was, as I'm sure both Janet and Leona know, a model that provided a much larger support system than just the student.
And so in the long term approaches that we're looking at, really that kind of support from the family and from the community, I think we want to really explore as much as we can, and particularly at the community level. Because if, let's say, we were going to do a needs assessment here in Blaine County, what would it take to get that started? Who would be really guiding that along? Is that something the school district does? Is that something parents do? Sounds like in Boise, it was kind of a coalition of different organizations.
Yeah, in the Treasure Valley, it was spearheaded by the United Way, and so Nora Carpenter, who is now and has been for a long time, she actually wasn't at the United Way when it got started, but she came in after the first year, and one of the challenges to her was to take a program within that Treasure Valley Ed Partnership called P16 that was funded for 3 years, as so many of these supplemental programs are, right? Like, here's a year or 2 years of funding, which is great. We're always grateful for funders, but 1 year will get you 1 year, and then there's more students behind that. And so what do you do in the next year? And she did just some extraordinary work in the community to bring together what's now called the Canyon County Hub, where what they recognized was that the school district really served as like this common area, just like the community campus in Haley, right? It's like that's a place that's easy-ish for most people to get to, and it houses a lot of organizations. Most people go there for some reason or another, and so she helped organize things like, okay, well, if everyone's coming on these days in March for kindergarten registration, what other services could we have available? So there was a mobile dental unit, right? There was a dental practice that had as part of its mission this mobile unit that would provide services free of charge. There were medical providers who did the same, counseling services, and on and on and on. And what was so great about that is, after a while, I never want to suggest that organizations doing this kind of work don't need funding, because we all do. But at the same time, in bringing the groups together in this way, it did allow everyone to leverage some resources that they otherwise wouldn't have. For example, we for a long time had an office out in Caldwell at the College of Idaho. As they grew, we lost that space, but we still had families. But it's very expensive for us to have another facility. And through this the Canyon County hub, we sent out a note and said, we have a couple clients who it's incredibly difficult for them to get to our Boise office. We're looking for space in Caldwell. And I'm not kidding, in like 10-15 minutes, I had 6 or 7 people saying, I had a church saying, we have an office we never used, the Y offered space. I mean, it was just incredible. It was much how I felt this summer in just starting to talk about this issue and needing resources and help, and everybody saying, yeah, what can I do? How can we come together? I think that spirit is there in Blaine County. In terms of who, I don't know, Heather's suggesting a bunch of different organizations. I'm not sure who it's going to come from. Maybe, I'm talking to a lot of different organization leaders. And so I'm sure here in the next couple of weeks, we'll have some answers on what that could look like and how to spearhead those efforts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to put you on the spot too much.
No, you didn't. I wish I had better answers. It's a significant undertaking, but we really do need it. I think it really is what needs to happen, because otherwise, I think we all keep working sort of with our head. There's so much to do, and we all sort of put our heads down and we're in our own lanes. And when we can take a minute to look up and say, wait a minute, do we want to stay on this perpetual, putting our finger in the holes, or do we want to take a step back and say, how can we bring about some more meaningful change in order to really address this in a way that's going to be more long lasting?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about just the times we're in. I mean, I think we all often have our heads down, and right now we are particularly needful of being responsive, and things are changing so much that I think we're in that a little bit more, and it can be a little bit harder to kind of step back and take a look at the long term. But I think, as with many things, we also have an opportunity. We've got a great opportunity to reshape some things as schools are changing, as we are recognizing how the opportunity gap is widening, and very specifically how that's happening in unusual circumstances. So I think, let's see. Yep, I like Heather's statement. If anyone Blaine County can do it, Heather. Yeah, I agree. I think we have the spirit here. I think we have the hope, and I think we have the people who will work. And so thank you all for your comments and your questions. And I think we'll close out here, but the conversation is obviously not over. It will keep going. And on behalf of the library, I want to thank Evelyn and Emily and the whole Lee Pesky crew for approaching us about doing this series and putting so much great work in to share data with you all and to share what they're doing, and for the library to have this opportunity to share what we're doing. We've really enjoyed this, and thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Have a good night.